As I said,
this is a demonstration of Flip
bit of a
Format.
discovery for all of us because this is a new system and we're all struggling how to use it. And perhaps the person that's struggling the most is me. So what I want to do is to deal with topic 1, which is Introduction to the Study of Second Language Acquisition. And I think what I'm going to do is to go through the different sections of this, and then I'm going to pause at the end of each section.
This is a demonstration
to
of Flip
invite
Format.
you to ask me any questions that you would like. Okay? Yeah? And if you want to ask a question, I think the easiest thing is to type it in the chat box window. I hope you can all see the chat box window. Okay? Are we ready?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
okay. Yeah.
This is a demonstration of Flip Format.
So, one of the first things that perhaps one of the first things that we should consider is why, as teachers, we should learn about how people acquire a second language. Perhaps the very first question, which is not on the handout, is that question. Why, as teachers,
this is a demonstration of Flip Format.
We should now, how are we going to handle responses to this? I don't really want to have to nominate people, but maybe I should to get started, yeah? So what about Maria? Maria, why do you think it is important that
This is a demonstration of Flip
learn
Format.
something about how people learn a language as teachers?
So can I talk? Does
talk.
everybody hear me, or?
Yeah, go ahead, Maria.
I think it's important to know, how people acquire a language so we can better teach them. So if I know the steps, how
This is
they
a demonstration
develop
of Flip Format.
so we can help them and support them in their steps in their development.
Okay. Tamia, you got anything to add to that? Why do you think as teachers it is useful to know how people learn a language?
I think as Maria told us that we know how they develop their language, and
This
then
is a
we just
demonstration
support them in
of
their
Flip Format.
development and know what they need or what are the gaps in their development so that we can fill.
Yeah. Yeah, I think both of you are fundamentally right. The real answer to this question is that clearly we want to try to teach in a way that is compatible with how people learn. In other words, we want to make sure that the way in which we teach the language matches the way in which people learn a language.
This is a demonstration of Flip Format.
So if we know more about how people learn a language, we are in a better position, if you like, to critique different approaches to teaching. We can critique them on the basis of whether a particular approach is or is not compatible with the way in which people learn a language. Let me just give you a quick example of that, right? A lot of language teaching is based on some kind of grammatical syllabus, i.e. a list of grammatical structures that are to be taught. And these are then taught in a linear sequence. In week 1, you teach the first grammatical structure, then you teach the next, and so on. So an assumption behind that kind of structural linear syllabus is that learners actually learn grammatical structures in an additive fashion. That
This is a demonstration
they learn one,
of
then they
Flip
add another, then they add another, etc. But do you think, in fact, this is how people learn a language? Do people learn a language in a linear way, structure by structure, adding one to another? Larry, any ideas on that one?
Let's see. Well, no, I would say that
it's more organic than that, and it's
This is a
more
demonstration
complex than
of
that.
Flip for
For
Mac.
example, I've watched students who they'll master one grammatical form, and then they'll move to the next form. Let's say they master simple tense, they go to past tense. That seems fine, but then they might oversimplify it, and then every verb they use, for example, they'll add an ed ending,
Right.
thinking that
So-
that works for every verb.
So in other words,
then-
yes, sorry, finish.
This is a demonstration
And
of
then
Flip for
also
Mac.
what I've noticed is, no, it's okay, after they've learned the past tense and I think they've got it, then there are times when they'll revert back to saying it incorrectly. So there seems to be this moving back and forth until they really acquire it.
Right. So in other words, the process by which people acquire a particular grammatical structure is really very gradual and dynamic. And this doesn't really
This
seem
is a
compatible
demonstration
with the
of
idea
Flip
that
for
you can
Mac.
teach one structure and learners learn it, and then you move on to another structure, and then they learn that. So that would suggest that in many ways there are problems with a structural or grammatical syllabus, because it makes an assumption about learning that doesn't seem to actually match the way in which learners learn. Okay, so that's a good starting point, and we should keep that particular point
This is
in
a
mind as we go
demonstration
through
of
this
Flip for
course.
Mac.
That is to say, we really need to bear in mind that our whole purpose in learning about second language acquisition is so that we can evaluate to what extent different approaches to teaching are compatible with the way in which learners learn. I'm now going to go on to section A in my notes, which is what is second language acquisition.
This
And
is
I
a
know that
demonstration
on the
of Flip for
discussion
Mac.
board, you were all asked to write your own definitions of second language acquisition. So what I'm going to do here is to run through a number of particular points that are relevant to producing a definition of what we mean by this term. All right? You can see that, first of all, the term second is generally used to refer to any language
This is a
other than
demonstration
the
of
first
Flip for
language.
Mac.
I don't know why I've said not the term additional language. Additional language is actually used sometimes as a substitute for the term second language. It's also important to make a distinction between second and foreign language acquisition. And I've suggested that this distinction is best really treated as
This
a
is a
sociolinguistic
demonstration
one
of Flip for
rather
Mac.
than a psycholinguistic one. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we should not necessarily assume that the processes involved in acquiring a second language are necessarily different from those acquiring a foreign language, that we could in fact find out that there are very, very similar processes involved in learning another language, an additional language, irrespective of whether it is in a second
This is a
language
demonstration
or
of Flip
a
for
foreign
Mac.
language context. So when I say that these terms are best simply treated as sociolinguistic terms, I mean that we should consider them as simply referring to the setting in which a language is learned, whether it's learned in a second language setting, such as English in the United States for many people, or a foreign language setting, such as a classroom in Japan, where learners are learning English.
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
Having said that, one should point out that the term second language acquisition is used as a superordinate term to cover both types of learning. So this is a little bit confusing. So when we talk about second language acquisition, we are in fact being neutral as to whether we are talking about learning in a second language setting or learning in a foreign language setting. The next point that we would need to consider is the
This is a
naturalistic
demonstration
versus
of Flip for
instructed
Mac.
language acquisition versus instructed second language acquisition. And again, we would have to ask, are these necessarily different, or are there in fact commonalities between the way in which people learn a language naturally through communicating in it, or is that different from instructed second language acquisition when they're in a classroom and they're receiving instruction. And
This is a
linked in
demonstration
part
of flip for
to
Mac.
the distinction between incidental and intentional language learning. Incidental language learning is learning that takes place without any specific deliberate attempt on the part of the learner to learn. I suppose another term for incidental language acquisition would be picking up the language. Intentional language learning is language learning where the learner makes some deliberate attempt to learn some bit or piece of the language, such as learning a grammatical structure or memorizing words, etc. In naturalistic language acquisition, most of the acquisition that takes place is probably going to be incidental, because learners are intent on trying to use the language as well as they can, and any learning that takes place is going to take place through their attempts to use the language. In
This is a
instructed
demonstration
language,
of
second
flip for
language
Mac.
acquisition, however, often, but not always, the learning will be intentional. That is to say, learners will know what it is they are trying to learn and will be making deliberate attempts to learn it. However, it is possible in instructed second language acquisition, in classrooms for example, for incidental acquisition to take place. And some approaches
This
to
is a
language
demonstration
teaching
of
do
flip
in
for Mac.
fact focus specifically on incidental language acquisition. I don't know how many of you are familiar with task-based language teaching, but one of the aims of task-based language teaching is to foster the kind of natural incidental processes of learning which occur in naturalistic contexts. The next point that we would have to consider is what it is that people are
This is a
learning
demonstration
in second
of flip
language
for Mac.
acquisition. What are they learning? And it's useful to make a distinction between two types of competence. In fact, these days researchers refer to three types of competence. To deal with the two that are down on your lecture notes, linguistic competence typically refers to the acquisition of the sound system of the language, the words that make up of the language,
This
and
is
the
a
grammatical
demonstration
structures.
of flip for Mac.
Communicative competence, on the other hand, involves the ability to use language in socially appropriate ways, the ability to produce continuous text, to produce continuous discourse, to link one utterance to another, to link one sentence to another in discourse. And also it involves what is often called strategic competence, which is the ability
This
to
is a
deal with
demonstration
problems that
of flip for
arise
Mac.
when one is actually trying to communicate. So we can ask, what is second language acquisition really about? Is it about acquiring linguistic competence, or is it about acquiring something more than that, communicative competence? And I said that there is a third way these days. The third way that is often mentioned in the literature is interactional competence, which is the ability to
This is a demonstration of flip
participate
for
in
Mac.
the turn-taking mechanisms that constitute a conversation. In other words, the ability to be able to hold a conversation, to open it, to continue it, to close it, etc. The ability to make your utterances relevant to what has just been said before. Now, if we look at the history of second language acquisition research, we can see that there has been a gradual shift, that in the early research,
This is a
the focus was
demonstration of
predominantly
flip
on
for Mac.
linguistic competence, in particular grammar. Then the focus began to switch more to communicative competence. How do learners manage to perform things like requests and apologies and invitations and refusals in ways that are socially acceptable? And then finally, some of the more current research focuses on how do learners manage to
This
hold
is a demonstration
conversations.
of flip for
How
Mac.
do they, for example, deal with problems that arise in conversations? The next point on the handout is acquisition versus learning. Acquisition versus learning. This was a distinction that was made by Krashen, and Krashen argued that there are two ways in which we develop a language, a second language. One
This is a demonstration of
which
flip format.
involves unconscious learning, and the other is learning which involves conscious, deliberate learning. In effect, this distinction is very similar to the incidental and intentional distinction. So acquisition takes place incidentally, without consciousness, and learning takes place intentionally, with consciousness. And that leads us to the final point on
This is a
my
demonstration
bullet point
of flip format.
on my points to consider in trying to define second language acquisition, and that is the difference between implicit and explicit learning. Acquisition involves implicit learning. The idea is that we can learn things without being conscious that we're learning them. I suppose if you think about it, there's all sorts of ways in which we learn implicitly.
This is a demonstration of flip format.
For example, when we learn to drive a car, primarily we're learning implicitly. We don't form explicit rules about how to drive a car. We pick up the techniques that we need implicitly through actually engaging in the activity of trying to drive a car. And similarly, it's suggested that when people acquire a second language, they can acquire it implicitly. In particular, through participating
This is
in
a demonstration of
they
flip
can
format.
pick up new words, new grammatical structures, new interactional structures, etc. Explicit learning, on the other hand, is the learning that takes place when one is quite conscious of what one's learning and when one actually forms some kind of explicit representation of what one's learning. For example, if one engages in explicit learning of
This
the
is a
present simple
demonstration
tense,
of
then
flip
one might
format.
form a rule that says when you use he, she, and it, you've got to put an S on the verb. And you can learn that explicitly, and you can form an explicit rule. So what I've gone through is some of the really key distinctions that exist in the study of second language acquisition, and that really have to be taken into account when we produce a definition of what we mean by
This is a
second language
demonstration
acquisition.
of flip format.
Okay, I said after each section I would pause and see if you have any questions or if you would like to comment on what I've just said. Can I suggest that if you want to ask a question, to stop everybody speaking at once, you use the chat box and just write your name, and then I'll call on you to ask a question or make a comment.
This is a demonstration
So let me pause
of flip
and see
format.
if there's anybody who would like to try to say something based or ask a question on what I have just gone through. And all you need to do is to type your name in the box. So Maria, you have mentioned about discourse competence. Maria, would you like to just speak to people and actually make clear what your question is?
This is a demonstration of flip format.
Hello? Hello? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, we seem to have lost Maria. We'll come back to Maria. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question here? Let's see.
This is a demonstration of flip format.
A comment. Tamia, would you like to say something or ask a question?
Yeah, I think my question is regarding the incidental learning in classroom.
Right.
How can we make teach learning in classroom an incidental one?
Well, the essential idea.
This is a demonstration
that's a very
of
good
flip
question,
format.
by the way. The essential idea of incidental acquisition is that you pick something up without making any real attempt to do so. That it happens incidentally, that it happens without deliberation. Okay? So obviously there are various teaching activities that do cater to incidental acquisition. Let me mention two. We might, for example, engage
This is a
learners
demonstration
in
of
some
flip
kind
for
of
Mac.
communicative task, where the focus is not on learning any specific vocabulary or any specific grammatical structure, but just on achieving the outcome to the task. I suppose the typical type of task that we might have in mind will be something like, say, spot the difference, where learners have two pictures and they have to describe each other. They have to describe their picture to the other student with a view to trying to
This
work
is a
out what the
demonstration
differences are
of
in the
flip for
picture.
Mac.
So that creates, if you like, a communicative context. And in that communicative context, it's possible for learners to incidentally pick up new vocabulary. For example, they may find that their partner uses a particular word and they don't understand it, and they indicate they don't understand it, and then their partner sort of clarifies what the meaning of it is, and that provides an opportunity for incidental
This is a
language
demonstration
learning. So there's
of
no
flip for Mac.
intention to learn specific vocabulary or specific grammatical structures, but they're picked up. And another way in which I think it can happen is through extensive reading. Extensive reading has always had quite a major role to play in language teaching. The idea that we should engage learners in wide reading. And the idea here is not that they just develop their reading ability, but they can actually
This
pick
is
up
a
new
demonstration
language through the
of flip for
process of
Mac.
trying to read. Okay? Elizabeth, I know you have a question as well. Sorry, do you want to come back on that, Tamir, quickly?
No.
Elizabeth, can you go ahead with your question?
Sure. In the text you mentioned, can you hear me?
No.
You can't hear me?
If you're having a problem in making us hear you, you can type the question instead.
This is
And
a
then we can all see
demonstration of flip for Mac.
All right. Here we go.
You're not coming through clearly, Elizabeth, for some reason.
Okay, I'm typing now.
Okay.
This is a demonstration of flip for Mac.
Well, we can all hear you typing. And while we're doing it, if anyone else has... Larry, that's a nice point. Lots of reading. My 10-year-old son is now increasing his vocabulary and grammatical accuracy through reading. Yes, and this is almost certainly happening incidentally. He's not making any deliberate attempt to learn particular words or master particular grammatical
This is a
structures.
demonstration of flip for Mac.
Okay, we're still waiting for your question, Elizabeth. Right. I mean, actually, this raises what is quite an important point, and that
This is a
what type of
demonstration
acquisition
of flip for
do you
Mac.
consider is perhaps most important? Is it incidental acquisition, or is it intentional language learning? Or in Krashen's terms, is acquisition more important than learning? Are they both equally important, etc.? And this is going to be one of the key issues that we will be looking at in this course. Elizabeth, you mentioned the difficulty of demonstrating whether a linguistic feature was learned, acquired consciously or otherwise.
This is a
Have any
demonstration
researchers
of flip
addressed
for
this
Mac.
particularly, and how? There in fact has been a lot of research that has tried to investigate to what extent learning does take implicitly, or to what extent there is always some element of consciousness involved. Typically, what this is done is through exposing learners to input that contains a particular grammatical structure.
This is a demonstration
and
of flip
then
for Mac.
afterwards testing to what extent they have learnt that particular structure, and at the same time asking them whether they were aware of what they learned. And what some of these studies have been able to show is that learners do learn implicitly up to a certain point. That is to say, they seem to have acquired knowledge of some
This is a
particular linguistic
demonstration
feature,
of flip
such as a
from act.
grammatical structure, without real any awareness that they have done so. So there is research that quite clearly suggests this, and I think really our own language learning experiences suggest that a lot of language learning must in fact be incidental. A key issue, though, is whether incidental or
This
implicit
is a demonstration
language learning
of flip from act.
are entirely devoid of consciousness. And later on we'll find out that we probably need to distinguish two types of consciousness. Consciousness at the level of noticing, which is momentarily noticing a particular feature in the input, and consciousness at the level of understanding. That is to say, understanding what a word means, understanding how a grammatical structure works. And some researchers
This is a
have
demonstration of flip
that
from act.
there's some degree of consciousness involved even in implicit and incidental learning, i.e. consciousness in terms of attention to a momentary attention to some specific linguistic feature that you've been exposed to, but not awareness at the level of understanding. Other researchers have argued, however, that there's no need for any conscious attention whatsoever.
This is a
Some learning
demonstration
can be
of flip
entirely
from
implicit.
act.
So this constitutes a sort of little area of controversy in the field of second language acquisition. Exactly how do we measure or define consciousness? Right, that's quite an issue. And the main way in which researchers have investigated consciousness is through learner self-report. That is, they have asked learners whether, in fact, they were
This is a
aware
demonstration
of
of flip from
a
act.
particular grammatical structure in the input. So as I said, they expose them to a grammatical structure, perhaps in a communicative context. They then test whether they have learned that grammatical structure, and they also ask them to self-report whether they are aware of it, etc. And basically, I suppose they are claiming that learners have learned implicitly and developed implicit knowledge of something.
This is a demonstration of
One, they
flip
are
from act.
able to demonstrate use of it, and secondly, they report no awareness of having learnt it, etc. Maria, 30 to 60 minutes. What's your mother language, and how seriously do you put the time aside every day? I'm not quite clear about that question.
This is a demonstration of flip from act.
Okay, let's leave that. I think, does anyone else have any other point that they would, these are very good questions. Has anyone else got any other point that they would like to mention? Okay. I think one of the things that you probably realized immediately, and that is that
This is a
trying to
demonstration
come to
of flip
grips with
from
what
act.
we mean by second language acquisition is not straightforward. There are no straightforward, simple definitions. That the second language acquisition construct is a very complex one. It involves looking at it in a number of different ways. Okay? I want to now go on, if I can, to section B in my notes, which is methodological issues.
This is a
in
demonstration
investigating second
of flip
language
from act.
acquisition. Can you see that there? Can everyone see it?
No, I can't see it.
You can't see it.
We can't
What
see
about
it
other
clearly.
people?
Yeah, it's only half of the screen.
Yeah,
I think you have-
I don't know how to make it bigger on your screen.
I think you have to click on the small pictures in your screen that it
This
will
is a
appear on our
demonstration
screen.
of flip from act.
This,
Or at least
Okay.
remove the preview.
oh, okay. How do I? Let me see if I can get rid of the screen with the preview. Does that make it bigger for you?
It hasn't
No.
changed.
Hasn't changed. No.
So what do I need to click here?
This is a
I think click
demonstration
on the
of Flip
preview.
for Mac.
That will appear here.
The preview. I don't know where the preview is. Oh.
Maybe if you hover your mouse over the middle of the two, like the dividing screens, you can use
This
it
is a
to move it over to
demonstration
the left
of
more,
Flip for Mac.
to minimize it.
Well, at the moment I've lost everything.
Uh-oh.
I seem to have lost everything here. Well, wait a moment. Wait a moment. Okay, I'm back again. So what was it you were suggesting that I have to do?
Maybe if you hover your mouse
This is a
over
demonstration
like
of
beside
Flip
that
for
ruler
Mac.
in the center of the page, and you'll get like a little icon that will show you how you can, minimize by dragging it over to the left, make it smaller.
No, I'm sorry. My screen. I've lost the preview now. Oh God.
This is a demonstration of
I've
Flip
lost
for
the
Mac.
preview.
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
I'm very sorry about this.
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
I've also lost the text completely now. Let me have another go. Is that any good? Does that help at all, people?
Yep.
This
Can
is
you
a
see it bigger
demonstration of Flip for Mac.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, we can see it, yeah.
Great.
Oh, sorry. This is a process of discovery for me. All right, let's carry on. We've got methodological issues in investigating second language acquisition. In other words, how do we know whether people has acquired something? How do we know whether people have learned something, right? And what I say here is what and how learners learn in L2 is not open to direct inspection.
This is a demonstration
In other
of Flip
words,
for
we
Mac.
can't look into learners' minds or brains and see whether there's been some change there that shows that they have learned something. So we can only actually infer whether people have learned something by examining their actual performance. In other words, examining their use of the language in some way. So one of the big questions that researchers face is
This is a demonstration
what kind
of Flip for Mac.
is going to provide the reliable, valid information about whether learners have learned something. Because when we use a language, we can use it in very different ways. So are there some ways that are going to provide a better idea of whether people have actually learned something than other ways? And you can see here that I say that many researchers analyze the actual utterance that
This
learners
is a
produce
demonstration
in
of Flip
speech
for
or
Mac.
writing. In other words, the type of performance that they look at is actual speech or actual writing. And many researchers would argue that what they call free constructed responses, that is to say free writing, free speech, provides the best indication of whether someone has actually learned something. Other researchers, however, suggest that it is
This
possible
is a demonstration
to
of flip from
investigate
Mac.
whether learners have learned something by looking at their intuitions about what is correct, or appropriate. There's a lot of kind of microphone noise coming on. Some try to tap learners' intuitions about what is correct or appropriate using grammaticality judgment tasks. So
This is a demonstration
of a
of flip from
grammaticality
Mac.
judgment task. Let's say I produce this sentence. Maria reported her father the problem. Maria reported her father the problem. Now, what are your intuitions? Is that sentence grammatical or is that sentence
This is a
ungrammatical?
demonstration of flip from
Would you
Mac.
like to perhaps type what your views are here? So if you think the sentence, do you want me to write the sentence? Maria reported her father the problem. And what I'm asking is for your intuitions as to whether this is in fact a grammatical sentence or ungrammatical.
This is a demonstration of flip from Mac.
Okay, so most of you feel that it's ungrammatical, and yes, I think probably most native speakers would agree that this sentence is ungrammatical, although of course learners may not. In fact, this sort of way of testing learners' knowledge has been used in second language acquisition, and it is clear that many learners feel that a sentence like Maria
This is a demonstration
reported
of flip from Mac.
her father the problem is in fact a perfectly grammatical sentence. Okay, so we've looked at two ways of actually measuring whether learners have learned something. One way is to look at their actual use of a particular grammatical or lexical feature in their speech or in their writing to see whether in fact they can use it
This is a
correctly.
demonstration of
Another
flip from
way
Mac.
is to use grammaticality judgments by giving them sentences like the one that I gave you and seeing in fact whether they can say whether it is grammatical or ungrammatical correctly. Another way is to ask learners to report on their own learning, to ask them to simply say whether they have learned something or whether they have not learned something. And what I then say is that different kinds of data
This is a
will be
demonstration
needed to
of flip from
investigate
Mac.
whether what learners know about the second language is implicit or explicit. So if we go back to the two main ways, for example, that is to say performance in speech or writing as opposed to grammaticality judgments, we can ask which of those is most likely to tell us whether the knowledge that they have is implicit or explicit. Would you say, for
This is a
example,
demonstration
that it
of
is
flip from Mac.
a speaking or writing task, or would you say that it's a grammaticality judgment task? What's the relationship between these different ways of measuring acquisition or learning and the kind of knowledge that is actually being measured? Do you want to see if you can type an answer to that?
This is a demonstration of flip from Mac.
If we want to find out whether learners have developed implicit knowledge, the kind of knowledge that comes from implicit learning, do you think that the best way to do this is through grammaticality judgments, or do you think the best way is through looking at their actual speech and writing?
This is a demonstration of flip from
Good.
Mac.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, speech and writing. Why? Because pretty clearly when learners are asked to judge whether sentences are grammatical or ungrammatical, they're likely to draw on their conscious explicit knowledge of the language, rather than what they know implicitly.
This is a demonstration of flip-for-mac.
Etc. Okay? So most second language acquisition researchers would prefer to try to investigate what learners have learned through looking at their speech or writing. Mind you, there's a difference between speech and writing. Which of those do you think is most likely to give us an indication of what learners have learned implicitly, of what their implicit unconscious knowledge is? Speaking or writing?
This is a demonstration of flip-for-mac.
Speaking. Why? Why speech? Why is it that speaking is likely to give us a much better picture of what learners have learned implicitly? Absolutely. It's impromptu, it's unplanned, it's spontaneous. In other words, they don't really have time to access their explicit knowledge, because generally speaking, explicit knowledge takes much more time. It's much more effortful to try to use our explicit knowledge than to try to use our explicit knowledge. Imagine, for example, trying to drive a car using just explicit knowledge of how to drive it. Clearly we have to draw on our implicit knowledge of what's required in order to drive a car. If we relied on our explicit knowledge, there would probably be a lot of accidents. Okay? All right. So we've dealt with the methodological issue. I make one other point, which is an interesting one, and that is that there's also the question of how we can determine whether a particular feature has been acquired. A distinction can be made between acquisition as emergence, or onset if you like, and acquisition as accurate use. In other words, we've got really two different ways of defining
this is a demonstration
what has been
of
acquired.
flip-for-mac.
One possible definition is simply, if you like, first use of a new linguistic feature, first use of a word, first use of a grammatical structure. A word, a grammatical structure that they have never used before, and now they are using it or trying to use it for the first time. So that's one definition, and that's what we mean by emergence or onset. And
this is a demonstration
the second
of
definition
flip-for-mac.
is probably the one that most of you orientate to, which is accurate use. We say that learners have acquired a grammatical structure if they can use it accurately. Okay? All right. Again, let me pause if I can and see if people have any questions or any comments that they would like to make.
This is a demonstration of flip-for-mac.
Well, let me ask you a question, and you can type your answers to it, all of you. All right? Ray, you have a question. Let me deal with your question first. Ray, do you want to actually speak your question?
This is a demonstration of flip-for-mac.
Ray says, I don't understand, pause people before you type. I don't understand how short-term proves acquisition. I think what you mean is that disputing whether we can really say that someone has acquired something because they are simply using
this is
a
a demonstration
for the
of
first time, a
flip-for-mac.
feature that they have not used before, and now they're using it. And you feel that, in fact, you should be defining acquisition in terms of target-like language use, accurate use. Is that correct, Ray? Right. Well, yes and no. I mean, clearly there's a difference between using a feature
this
for the
is
first
a demonstration
time,
of
but not
flip-for-mac.
necessarily being able to use it correctly all the time, but still being able to use it, as opposed to being able to use it correctly all or most of the time. And it seems to me that both of those ideas are interesting, because acquisition is a process. And the process has got to start by learners using a particular linguistic feature for the first time. There has to be an initial moment where they try to use it. And surely that does demonstrate that some acquisition, some learning has taken place. They couldn't use it before, they can use it now. On the other hand, probably yes, as teachers, we do want to know whether they can actually use the grammatical feature accurately. So if we view acquisition as a process, we can say it starts off with emergence, but probably not totally correct use, and gradually learners learn to use that particular feature more and more accurately. And surely it's of interest to us to look at both, isn't it? To look at when new features emerge in learners' speech or in learners' writing, and also when they achieve actual mastery of them. Do you think that we should only be concerned with complete accuracy? And Ray talks about the fact that language acquisition involves stages. So if we want to look at the early stage of how learners acquire a grammatical structure, we've got to look at emergence. We've got to look at onset. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on because we've only got a few minutes left, right? And you can see below that I've got information about a case study, right? Can you see that? This is a case study that was carried out by Richard Schmidt, and he looked at a Japanese painter called Wes, who came to live in Hawaii. And I think he followed him for a very large number of years with a view to trying to see what happens as he slowly developed competence in English, both communicative and linguistic competence in English. And one of the things that he found out, if I turn to the main findings, you can see what the main findings here. Wes's pronunciation was good, especially his intonation, but his grammar hardly developed over the 3-year period. Of 9 grammatical morphemes, structures, for example, progressive verb eng, third person s, only 3 reached the 90% criterion level of accuracy. So he only achieved complete accuracy, or more or less complete accuracy, in 3 out of the 9 features that
This is a demonstration of flip format.
You can also see that he did seem to develop some degree of communicative competence. That is to say, he was able to perform directives, that's a kind of requesting, in a largely socially appropriate way. But he also used some quite idiosyncratic ways. And we can also see
this is a demonstration of flip format.
A high level of discourse competence, which compensated for her linguistic weaknesses. In other words, what we are saying here is that in 3 years, Wes did not seem to improve in terms of grammatical accuracy, but his overall communicative abilities improved considerably. Right? So really, this raises
a demonstration
of flip questions. And one question that it raises, or the 2 questions that it raises, are the ones that Maria wanted us to deal with. Sorry, there's a lot of interference noise coming, and I don't know why this is. Is someone got some kind of electronic device in the background that is creating this kind of noise?
This is a demonstration of flip format.
Okay, let's see if we can continue. That's a little bit quieter. Okay, thank you very much. It raises what are 2 key issues, and these are the role of age in language learning, and also whether there is such a thing as fossilization. And I'd like to take the concept of fossilization first, if I could. Okay?
This is a demonstration of flip format.
Perhaps I could ask someone to tell me what fossilization is, or what their understanding of this word fossilization is. If you'd like to have a go, please type your name and then I'll call on you and let's hear your voice. Elizabeth, I'm going to go with you first. Maria will give you a chance in a moment, okay? Elizabeth, would you like to tell us,
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac,
what you think fossilization is?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello? Hello? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Fossilization is when language learning ceases before the person has reached the target level.
No, Mary, I'm sorry, Elizabeth. We got the same problem as before. It's not clear. You
This
kind
is
of
a
fade in, fade
demonstration
out.
of Flip for Mac.
So here we go. Meanwhile, Maria, do you want to try and have a go and say what your understanding of fossilization is? While we're waiting for Elizabeth to type, Maria, do you want to go?
I'm just going to try, okay?
Thank you very much.
Okay, fossilization is, I think, when
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
I reach my end and we can't learn more, but we never reach the level of a native speaker. So
Okay.
I guess we improve and we improve, but we never reach the level of a native speaker.
Okay. Yeah. Again, wasn't so easy to hear. Did the others of you manage to hear it? Or shall we wait for Elizabeth to write it?
This is a demonstration
Laurel, would you like to have
of Flip
a go?
for Mac.
I see a yes there.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
and you're quite clear at the moment.
Great. I'm just going to say what everybody else has, but say it clearly. It's when you are unable to go forward with your language learning before you have reached the period where the target acquisition.
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
Right. Okay, that's pretty good, yeah? So the idea that I think Maria and Laurel were trying to put forward was that maybe it's the case that in second language acquisition, unlike in first language acquisition, learners often do not achieve full native-like competence. That is, they do not achieve full grammatical
This is a demonstration
accuracy and the full
of
range
Flip
of
for Mac.
grammatical structures. They're not able to use words in a totally native-like way. That language learning, if you like, ceases. It stops. And that's the underlying idea of fossilization. So one possible explanation for why Wes did so badly was that he had fossilized. His grammatical development had stopped. Communicative
This
skills
is a demonstration
did
of Flip for Mac.
continue to improve, but his actual grammatical development seemed to have more or less stopped. So this raises what I think is probably the key question with fossilization. Is there such a thing? Do learners fossilize? Is there such a thing as fossilization? Does learning cease before learners reach native-like competence? What do you think?
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
Larry, what do you think? Do you think that particularly adult learners, that fossilization kicks in, that they are not really able to go on and achieve full native speaker competence?
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced that it's fossilization. I think with adult learners, you reach a point where you're comfortable in your communication. I know with myself in Japanese, there's only one verb form that I cannot correctly use. Everything else is fine. And rather than tackle that complicated verb form, which we don't, it's a passive verb form, which you don't have in English.
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
Just change how I want to say something or use a strategy to not have to use that form. So I'm thinking that if other learners are like myself, it's not a matter of fossilization, but it's a matter of reaching a point where you can communicate, how can I say,
Good enough.
You can communicate at a level where you don't have any problems, and so you have no motivation to go above that.
Right. I think that's
This
a
is
very
a demonstration
possible
of flip format.
explanation for why learning seems to cease to stop. Of course, I think implicit in your explanation is that if your communicative needs change for some reason, that is to say, it becomes much more important for you to achieve native-like competence in the verb tense that you have not yet completely mastered, then probably you would unfossilize and learning would continue, right?
I would agree.
So one possibility
This is a demonstration of flip format.
possibility is that fossilization is very closely connected with communicative need. That is to say, you learn as much of the language as you need in order to satisfy your communicative needs. And once you've satisfied them, maybe you stop learning, right?
Yes.
This would suggest, therefore, that there's no such thing as absolute fossilization, because it's always possible that where communicative needs change, you will continue to learn.
This is a
and there are other
demonstration
theories of
of
second
flip
language
format.
acquisition that would also suggest that there's no such thing as fossilization. There is a theory called complexity theory, which I'm going to type here, and I'm not going to go into detail about this now. But complexity theory argues that learning always continues, even in native speakers. That as we are continually exposed to language, so what we have internalized about that language will change in very small ways, etc. And again, from the point of view of complexity theory, therefore, there's no such thing as complete fossilization. Change is always going on. Of course, the change may be so micro, so small, that it will not be immediately apparent. It will not become apparent until some threshold has
This is a demonstration
place,
of flip format.
which then makes it quite clear that learning has in fact continued. And a lot of researchers these days would adhere to complexity theory and argue that change is always going on in language systems as a product of continued exposure to the language. The other key issue, and I'll deal with this quite quickly because we're nearly at the end of our class.
This is a demonstration of flip format.
Is age. And this is also clearly a possible reason for why WES failed to go on to achieve native-like competence. It's possible that as an older learner, and by older we typically mean someone who is past the age of 15 or 16, that they have passed, if you like, a critical period.
This is a demonstration of flip format.
To actually learn the language. In other words, if you like, there are changes that take place in our neural structure, in our brains, that make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for us to achieve full native speaker competence past a certain age. And what the critical period hypothesis claims is that if you start to learn a language before that critical period, then you have a chance of going on and achieving full native speaker competence. If, on the other hand, if you start to learn a language later, perhaps post-puberty, then it's going to be difficult, perhaps impossible, for you to actually acquire a language. And this is known as the critical period hypothesis. So let me just put this up. I'm going to write this. Oh, I didn't write. There's complexity
This is a
theory.
demonstration
And
of
here
flip
is
format.
critical period hypothesis. If I can spell it correctly. Critical period hypothesis. Oh.
This is a demonstration of flip format.
Period hypothesis. Okay, sorry, for some reason it's not working. It's not going up when I tell it to. The critical period hypothesis simply claims that if you start to learn a language past a certain age, and typically the age given is somewhere around 11 or 12.
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
It could be later in the terms of grammar, more like 15 or 16, you're unable to achieve native-like competence. I'm going to make a quick comment on this, and then we'll finish. The critical period hypothesis, like a lot of stuff in second language acquisition, is controversial. There are some researchers who say that there is clear evidence of it, and there are other researchers who argue that there is no clear evidence.
This is a demonstration
and in fact,
of Flip
some
for Mac.
learning always goes on, and it's possible for learners who have started even at the age of 17, 18, 19 to achieve native-like competence in, say, the grammar of a language. And indeed, there are studies that show that it is possible to achieve native-like grammar even if you start post-puberty, in effect. So this is another very controversial area. My own reading of the research
is a demonstration
would be to
of Flip for
suggest
Mac.
that there is no such thing as a critical period, that learning does go on in older learners and can be ultimately very, very successful, leading to native-like competence, but that as you get older, it is more and more difficult to actually acquire a language. In other words, there's no critical period, there's no cutoff point, but there's a sort of gradual
This is a demonstration
decline
of Flip for
from
Mac.
probably round about the age of 6 onwards in one's ability to actually acquire a language. And obviously if you get up to my age, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but if you get up to my age, then I'm telling you it gets very, very difficult to learn a second language. And I am a pretty useless language learner at the moment. Okay, well, this has been a little bit of a struggle.
This is a demonstration
of
Flip for Mac.
the sort of technological problems that we've been having, or at least I've been having. I hope I gradually get the hang of this system and learn how to use it properly. I do want to end up with one request. Who is the student coordinator? Who is the discussion board coordinator for this week that has just
This
finished?
is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
The person who coordinates the discussion board and gets it started. Do we know who it is?
Yes,
Who is that?
Matty and Erica.
Okay, thank you very much. What I would like to suggest is that after our class each week, and after you've gone through the discussion board questions and participated in
This is a demonstration
discussion
of
board
Flip for
activity, what I would like is for the student coordinators each week, the student leaders each week, to collect questions from everybody, which can then be sent to me. And then I'm going to write answers to these questions. So what I'm saying is that each week, after our lesson, think of any particular questions that you have that you would really like answering.
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
The student coordinator, and that student coordinator can then send me the questions in an email, and I will write response and post responses to them. Okay? Sorry?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is
that Maria?
That's me.
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
This week.
No, I can't hear you clearly, Maria. I'm sorry.
Okay. Wait, hang on. There was a lot of confusion this week about the allotments. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Maria, could I ask you to kind of send me an email about it? It would be easier to deal with that rather than try and sort it out here.
Okay.
If there's a problem with the allotment, then just send me an email and I'll really try to sort it out quickly. Okay?
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
All right. Well, thank you all for turning up to class. I hope that you haven't found it too painful experience. I must admit I found it a little bit difficult, but I guess I am going to get the hang of this as we go along. Okay. So I'll look forward to receiving all your questions, okay? All right, can we all say goodbye? All right.
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
Goodbye.
This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac. This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac. This is a demonstration of Flip for Mac.
Hey, is Brandon out there? Brandon.
Hey man, I was just gonna come on.
Hey,